The Hollow Carnival. It came to town on a bitter, windswept night. The kind of night when the cold crawls under your skin and the sky feels like it's about to crack. The town of Black Hollow had been quiet for weeks. The streets covered in snow, the homes empty and silent, as if the life had been sucked out of it. And then, as if pulled from the pages of some twisted dream, the carnival arrived. It wasn't a grand affair. No, it wasn't like the kind of carnival you'd find in the big city with its neon lights and towering roller coasters. This one was small, old-fashioned, and strange. The tents were faded, the colors muted by time and snow. But there was something magnetic about it, something that made it impossible to look away, as if the very sight of it stirred something deep inside, something lost in the back of your mind. Jack Thomas, a father still reeling from the loss of his wife to cancer, noticed the carnival first. He was on his way to pick up his son, Danny, from school when the sound of distant music reached his ears. He stopped in his tracks, eyes narrowing. The carnival should not have been there. The nearest one was 100 miles away. But there it was, at the edge of town, its lights flickering through the falling snowflakes like a beacon in the dark. It was Danny who first begged Jack to take him to see it. "Please, Dad, I've never seen anything like it before." Jack hesitated. He didn't have much energy for thrills these days. Ever since his wife's death, he'd been numb, just going through the motions. But he couldn't deny the way Danny's eyes shone with excitement. It had been a long time since he'd seen his son this happy. The carnival was exactly what Danny had hoped for. Magical, otherworldly. There were tents with strange lights, games with prizes that seemed too perfect to be real, and a Ferris wheel that reached impossibly high into the sky. But something felt wrong. Jack couldn't put his finger on it at first. It was as if the carnival was a dream, but a dream with an edge, something lurking just beneath the surface. They wandered through the attractions, Jack trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The workers, the people running the games and rides, had an odd way about them. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too hollow, as though they had forgotten what it was like to be human. But Danny was too entranced. He begged for tickets, dragging Jack from one attraction to the next, laughing all the way. And then, as they passed the sideshow tent, Jack felt a strange pull, something that made him stop in his tracks. It wasn't the music, it wasn't the lights, it was the whispers. They came from inside the tent, muffled but clear enough that Jack couldn't ignore them. He turned to Danny. "We need to go, Danny, now." But Danny didn't hear him. He was already running toward the entrance to the tent, his eyes wide with wonder. "Dad, come on. It's amazing in there." Jack's heart sank as he followed, too late to stop him. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the smell of popcorn and something darker, something metallic. The sideshow performers were twisted things, half human, half animal, and their eyes followed Jack and Danny as they moved deeper into the tent. Danny grabbed his arm. "Look, Dad." The fortune teller, Jack's stomach churned as they approached the crystal ball. The woman sitting behind it was old, her skin pale and stretched tight across her skull. Her eyes were black, empty sockets that seemed to pierce through Jack. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice a rasping whisper that made Jack's skin crawl. "None of you should." Before he could respond, Danny reached out and touched the crystal ball. The lights in the tent flickered, and the temperature dropped suddenly, as though a shadow had fallen over them. Danny gasped, stepping back. "What's wrong?" Jack asked. Danny's face had gone pale. His lips trembled as he whispered, I don't feel good, Dad. I feel dizzy." Jack reached for him, but before he could take his son's hand, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The carnival, the people, the lights, it all blurred together. The world seemed to dissolve, and in that moment, Jack understood. The carnival wasn't just a carnival. It was something else. Something that fed on the living. The fortune teller smiled, her teeth too sharp for a human. "The carnival has you now. You will never leave." And then everything went dark. When Jack came to, he was alone. The tent was gone. The carnival was gone. Only the empty, snow-covered streets of Black Hollow remained. Panic surged through him as he screamed Danny's name, but there was no response. He ran through the streets, but no one else was there. No one had seen the carnival. It was as if it had never existed. Days turned into weeks, and Jack's search for Danny became an obsession. He went back to the carnival site, hoping to find a clue, anything that could explain what had happened. And then he found it. An old ticket booth buried under snow, the paint chipped and faded. There was a sign above it, rusted with age, that read, "The Hollow Carnival. Enter at your own risk." And then, in the snow, a single ticket. Danny's ticket. Jack's heart pounded as he held it in his hand, the realization settling in like a weight on his chest. The carnival wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting, hidden just beyond the veil. He had to stop it. Jack knew now that the carnival was alive, fed by the souls of the guests who entered it. The souls of the lost, the frightened, the willing. And Danny, his son, was one of them. A part of him was trapped at the carnival, forever feeding its hunger. Jack didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. He had to destroy it. But how do you destroy something that's made of fear? How do you kill something that feeds on the living? The answer was simple. You face it. You face your worst fear, and you destroy it from within. With nothing but his love for his son, Jack returned to the carnival grounds, knowing full well that once he entered, he might never leave. But he would face whatever waited in that dark, twisted place, no matter the cost. He had to, because his son was still out there, somewhere in the hollow darkness of the carnival, waiting for him. And Jack would never stop looking. The midnight carver. It was always the same. The dread creeping in, slow at first, like a chill on the back of your neck, until it grew into something that could claw at your soul. Every 13 years, like clockwork, the midnight carver came to the town of Elm's Hollow. No one could remember the first time it happened, only that it had. and after each visit, the town fell into silence, like an old wound that had been stitched shut, only for the pain to fester again. It was on the night of the 13th year when the air grew heavy with the weight of unspoken fears that 5 teenagers, 3 boys, 2 girls, decided to face the darkness head-on. They were restless, hungry for adventure, and too young to understand the gravity of the evil that had haunted their town for generations. Jake, the ringleader of the group, was the first to say it aloud. "We need to find out who, or what, the Midnight Carver really is." "No one knows," Sarah, his best friend, said, her voice a mix of fear and curiosity. "We've only heard the stories. People whisper about him in town, but no one dares to speak his name too loud." They'd heard the stories all their lives. A shadowy figure, a man in a tattered cloak, carving cryptic messages into the flesh of his victims. It wasn't just the gruesome nature of his deeds that terrified the townsfolk. It was the fact that every time the Carver visited, the messages were always the same. "The fear you feed will be your end." The first victim had been Old Man Jenkins, a hermit who lived on the edge of town. That was over 100 years ago. The last victim had been the mayor's wife, just 2 years ago. And now, it was time again. They could feel it in the air. The whispers that started after sunset. The way the wind carried something more than just the usual chill. The group gathered near the town square, where the old church stood, its steeple jutting into the sky like a needle piercing the night. They didn't know where to start, but Jake had a plan. "We find the place where the Carver began," he said, his voice determined. "That's where we'll find the truth." They walked to the old cemetery at the edge of town, where the gravestones leaned to the side, cracked with age. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the crumbling stone walls. The wind whispered through the trees, as if it knew what was coming. As they stepped into the graveyard, the air turned colder. Colder than it had any right to be. Sarah shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around her. "Jake, are you sure about this?" Jake nodded. "It's the only way. We have to understand the Carver to stop him." The group reached the old stone church, where the door creaked open with a groan, as if the building itself had been waiting. Inside, the faint smell of incense and rot hung in the air. The pews were overturned, the floor cracked and broken, and there, in the center of the room, was a strange symbol carved into the floor, an intricate spiraling design that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "That's it," Jake breathed. "That's the mark." Suddenly they heard a sound, soft at first, like a scraping against stone. Then louder. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from below them. The sound of something, someone, carving into flesh. The group froze. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. But no one moved. They were rooted to the spot, as if the fear had grabbed hold of them and wouldn't let go. And then they saw it. A shadow in the doorway, stretching long across the floor. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, dragging something behind it. A glint of metal caught the moonlight. The Carver. His face was hidden beneath the hood of his cloak, but his hands, those were clear. They were covered in blood, and in his grip was a long, jagged knife. The blade gleamed with the promise of pain. "We didn't mean to disturb you," Jake stammered, his usual bravado crumbling. The carver didn't speak. He just stood there, watching them with something that could almost have been amusement in the darkness of his eyes. "We're not afraid," Jake said, but even he could hear the lie in his voice. The carver's lips twisted into a grin, if you could call it a grin. His lips were cracked, as though they hadn't been used in years. "You should be," he whispered. "The fear you feed will be your end." A scream erupted from the group as the carver lunged forward, his blade flashing in the dark. But then something strange happened. The knife stopped just inches from Sarah's throat. The air was thick with static, like the sky itself was holding its breath. And then they realized the truth. The carver wasn't just a man. He wasn't just a figure of nightmare. He was the embodiment of their fear, the collective terror that had been passed down through generations, fed by the whispers of every victim, every ghost story, every terrified child. Every time they whispered his name, they gave him life. And now, as their own dread filled the room, it fed him more. "You made me," the carver said, his voice low, guttural. "You made me real." The teenagers tried to run, but they were paralyzed by the terror that surged through their veins. Each step they took felt like dragging themselves through molasses. The carver's form began to dissolve into smoke, his figure becoming a blur of darkness, slipping in and out of reality. But his presence was still there, pressing against them, filling them with suffocating fire. As the town clock struck midnight, the sound of the bell was drowned out by the scraping noise that echoed through the town. The carving had begun, and the midnight carver would return again in another 13 years to feed on their fear once more. This time, though, there would be no forgetting. The teenagers had become part of the story now. They were the next generation, the next link in the chain. The carver would never leave Elm's Hollow. He was its creation, and they were now his. And the cycle would continue until the town no longer remembered why it had ever been afraid. Echoes of the cellar jack. Hunter had always dreamed of writing a novel that would make a mark, but after years of rejection letters and broken dreams, he had given up on the city's promise of success. The constant noise, the rush of life that moved faster than his thoughts. He had become lost in it all. So, when the ad for the old Victorian house popped up online, he knew it was time to change. A quiet place, a place for inspiration. The house stood on the outskirts of a small town, just far enough from the chaos to give him peace, but close enough that he could visit if he ever wanted to. It was as if it had been waiting for him. Tall, dark, and covered in ivy. The house had a sort of eerie charm, but it was cheap, and that was all Jack cared about. He'd moved in on a Thursday. By the end of the week, he had set up his typewriter, unpacked his meager belongings, and sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the overgrown garden, waiting for the ideas to come, but they didn't. Inspiration wasn't kind to him. That was when he noticed the cellar door. It had always been there, just beneath the staircase. But somehow, it seemed to call to him now. Maybe it was the shadows that seemed to curl around the wooden frame, or the strange hum that seemed to come from beneath the earth. Jack wasn't sure what it was. Curiosity, desperation, loneliness. But something drove him to open it. The stairs creaked under his feet as he descended into the dark, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling like a dead eye. And then he saw it. An antique radio, dusty and out of place, sat on a rickety wooden table. Its dials were old-fashioned, the kind of thing you'd see in a history book. But the eerie hum that filled the room made it feel alive. Jack, too curious to leave it untouched, turned the dial. A crackling sound broke the silence, followed by a voice. It was distorted at first, but Jack could hear the words clearly. "Don't go near the water," the voice warned. Jack blinked, taken aback. It wasn't the voice of the radio. It was a woman's voice, strong but trembling, like someone speaking from the grave. He turned the dial again, eager for another message, but the radio cut out, replaced by static. A few moments later, another voice crackled through. "I'm not going to make it tonight," a man's voice said, soft and sad. "I should have listened." Jack's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just any radio. Something was wrong with it, but the lure of the voices was too strong to resist. He listened every night, each time hoping for a new clue, a new story. Soon, he started hearing names. People he didn't know. Sometimes the voices were urgent, like a warning. Other times they were resigned, as if they already knew their fate. One night, he heard a voice, clear and urgent. "Jack, you need to leave. Don't wait. They're coming for you." The chill that ran down his spine was different this time. This time, the message wasn't from the past. It was meant for him. Jack raced to the radio, fingers trembling as he spun the dial wildly. It wasn't long before another voice filled the air, this one so familiar it made his blood freeze. "Jack Hunter," it said, a deep guttural voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. "You've been listening to me for far too long. Now it's your turn." The room went cold. Jack's breath became shallow, his heart racing as he stumbled back from the radio. He knew then. It wasn't just a voice. It was something more. Something that could see him, know him. Something that had been watching him, waiting. The voice spoke again, its tone full of menace. "You think you can escape? Do you think you can hide from what's already been set in motion? I have been with you from the moment you stepped into this house. I am part of it. And now, you will be part of me." Jack's mind spun. He had to find out who or what was behind it. The voices had to be connected to something. Something old, something dangerous. He spent days combing through the house, searching for clues, but the answers were always just out of reach. The more he searched, the more the voices grew louder and more frequent. The warnings became dire. "It's too late. Run, Jack, run." And then came the final chilling message. "You're already dead." The radio crackled and went silent. Jack ran upstairs, heart pounding in his chest, as the cold, suffocating air filled the house. The doors slammed shut behind him. He couldn't escape. The cellar was no longer just a room beneath the house. It was a doorway, a door that led to something beyond the grave. And then he heard it, his voice whispering through the static. "Jack Hunter, the end is near." The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, deafening until they consumed him. The walls seemed to close in. And as the voices echoed through the house, Jack knew that the house had claimed him, just as it had claimed all the others before him. The radio, silent now, stood as the only witness to the curse that would last forever. And somewhere, deep in the cellar, the voices of the dead continued to play, whispering waters. The storm came out of nowhere. One minute, the sky was as clear as glass. The kind of summer evening where the air smells like salt and the sun hangs heavy, just a few degrees from setting. The next minute, the wind was howling like something from the depths of hell, tearing at the fishing boats, snapping the lines, and turning the waves into mountains. By the time the storm passed, the town of Gulls Cove had been battered. But it wasn't the broken homes or the flooded streets that had the people talking. No, it was the wreck. It had appeared overnight, like some dark gift from the ocean. The shipwreck was discovered on the rocky shoreline just past the cove, half sunk into the sand, its twisted frame poking out of the water like the skeleton of some ancient creature. Its sails were torn, its hull cracked, and its wood blackened, as though it had been in the water for years. But no one recognized the ship. There were no markings, no name to tell where it had come from. The wreck exuded a strange aura, something cold and wrong, like the ship itself was alive. A group of the townsfolk, old-timers, fishermen mostly, gathered by the wreck the next morning. They were cautious, their eyes flicking nervously at the water. None of them had seen anything like it before. The ship was old, older than anything that had ever come to these shores. But what made it worse wasn't the ship itself. It was the whispers. At first, people thought it was the wind, howling through the gaps in the ship's broken structure. But the voices didn't sound like the wind. They sounded human. Distant, muffled voices. Soft at first, like a distant murmur. But when you stood close enough, you could almost make out words. The first to hear them was Tom Fisher, an old fisherman who had lived in Gulls Cove all his life. He was a man who didn't scare easily, but when he stood by the wreck, the whispers called to him. They were soft, almost gentle at first. "Come closer," they said. "We need you." He looked around, but no one else seemed to hear it. He stepped closer to the water, the whispers growing louder with each step, like the ocean itself was speaking directly to him. "Tom, come closer. You must help us." He stopped, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. But it wasn't fear that drove him. It was curiosity. He leaned forward, closer to the wreck, until the voices seemed to be coming from inside the ship, calling to him, like a lover's whisper in the dark. "Help. Us." The next morning, Tom Fisher was gone. At first, they thought it was just an old man getting lost in the storm. Maybe he fell into the water, or maybe he wandered too far. But when the search parties came back empty-handed, the people of Gull's Cove began to notice something strange. More people were hearing the whispers. The fishermen, the shopkeepers, even the children playing on the beach. They all heard it, the soft, insistent calls from the wreck, luring them closer, beckoning them to come closer to the water. As the days passed, more people vanished. Sarah Galloway, a widow who lived near the shore, heard the whispers while hanging laundry on her porch. "Come, Sarah," they said to her. "Come join us." She stood frozen, staring at the water, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to fall away. She felt herself moving, her feet lifting from the ground, drawn to the water, but then something inside her snapped. With a force she didn't know she had, she turned and ran back into her house, slamming the door behind her. But she could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, like they were just outside her window. Then it happened. The night that broke the town's spirit. It was just after dusk when the whispers reached their peak. A strange fog rolled in off the water, thick and unnatural, covering the cove in an instant. The town was shrouded in silence, the air so still it felt as though the world had stopped breathing. And then, from the fog, they came. The figures were like shadows, but not quite. They had no faces, no distinct features. They were like smoke that had taken form, dark, swirling shapes that moved with purpose, their bodies constantly shifting, like the mist itself. They were the spirits of the drowned sailors, lost to the sea long ago, their lives claimed by the ocean's hunger. And they had come for the people of Gull's Cove. The whispers became screams, louder now, piercing the air with desperation. "Help us," they cried. "Help us! Free us!" But it wasn't help they needed. It was vengeance. The ship had been cursed, the souls of the sailors trapped in the wreck, never able to rest. And every soul they took, every life they lured to the water, made them stronger. It fed the ship, kept it alive, kept the spirits chained to the wreck for eternity. The townsfolk tried to fight back, but it was no use. The water seemed to reach out, pulling them toward it, dragging them into the sea. They would struggle, scream, but in the end, they would be taken. By morning, only a handful remained. Among them was Jack Winters, a father whose son had disappeared weeks before. Jack had heard the whispers too. But unlike the others, he hadn't been drawn to them. Instead, he had made up his mind to face the source of it all, to find the truth behind the ship and put an end to it. Jack stood at the edge of the water, looking out at the wreck. His heart was heavy with grief, the pain of losing his son still fresh. He knew he wasn't the first to try to stop it, but maybe he was the one who could end it. He walked toward the wreck, his breath shallow in his chest but steady. He had no illusions. He wasn't here to save anyone. He was here to destroy the ship, to end the curse. He raised his voice, though he knew it was useless. "You won't take me." And then the whispers came, louder than ever, all around him, like a chorus of drowned souls, calling out from the depths of the ship. But Jack wasn't afraid. Not anymore. With a final desperate cry, he ran toward the wreck. The spirits screamed, the ship creaked and groaned, but Jack didn't stop. He hurled himself into the water, his body crashing into the wreck. The last thing he heard before the world went dark was the softest whisper just behind his ear. "Thank you." When the tide rolled out the next morning, the wreck was gone. The water was calm. The sky clear once more. But the people of Gulls Cove knew better. The whispers had stopped for now, but the spirits hadn't been freed. They would return, and the water would always whisper. The bleeding season after one. A strange autumn. It started in late September, the season arriving in the small town of Ashburn like an unexpected guest. The summer heat lingered longer than usual, leaving the townsfolk cranky and restless. Then, without warning, the trees turned overnight. By morning, the town's oaks, maples, and birches were ablaze in hues of crimson and gold. For a few days, it was beautiful. Then the leaves began to bleed. At first, nobody believed what they were seeing. Red droplets glistened on the leaves, trickling down the bark like slow-moving tears. When one of the kids dared to touch it, thinking it might be sap, his fingers came away sticky and red. The local sheriff, Tom Hale, was the first to test it. "Damned if it ain't blood," he muttered, staring at the vial of deep red liquid in his hand. His deputy laughed it off nervously, but Tom couldn't shake the chill running down his spine. The bleeding trees became the talk of the town. Journalists from nearby cities came to gawk and snap pictures. Scientists sent samples to labs, but the results were inconclusive. Then, the animals started acting strange. Birds perched in eerie silence, watching from the rooftops with unblinking eyes. Deer wandered into town in broad daylight, their antlers coated in the same red sap. People started to whisper that something wasn't right. Chapter 2. The botanist Dale Greaves had lived on the outskirts of Ashburn for 20 years. A retired professor of botany, he'd moved to the quiet town to escape the noise of city life and bury himself in his books and plants. He was a solitary man, the type the townsfolk referred to as quirky at best and weird at worst. But when the trees began to bleed, people started showing up at his door. "It's not natural," said Martha, the owner of the diner. She held out a leaf dripping with blood. Dale took it carefully, his pale blue eyes narrowing. "No," he said finally, his voice low. "It's not." Dale's curiosity overpowered his unease. He spent days collecting samples, dissecting leaves, and examining bark under his old microscope. What he found didn't make sense. The blood was biologically similar to human blood, but carried an ancient, identifiable strain of DNA. The trees, it seemed, were alive in a way he couldn't comprehend. Late one night, Dale's studies were interrupted by a knock at his door. It was Sheriff Hale. "Need you to come with me," the sheriff said. "It's getting worse." Chapter 3. The Madness. By October, the town's mood had shifted. People were jittery, quick to anger. Fights broke out in the streets over trivial matters. A local preacher declared the bleeding trees a sign of God's wrath, while others whispered about curses and witches. Then came the disappearances. First, a teenage girl vanished on her way home from school. Then an entire family was found missing. Their car still parked in the driveway. The only clue was a trail of bloody footprints leading into the forest. "It's the trees," Dale told Sheriff Hale one night as they sat in the small cluttered station. "I think they're feeding." Hale's face darkened. "Feeding? On us. On our fear, our anger, maybe even our blood." The sheriff leaned back, his chair creaking. "Dale, I'm not saying I believe you, but how do we stop it?" Dale hesitated, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. "We have to find the source. Something's awakened them, and I think it's tied to the old massacre." Chapter 4. The Forest's Secret. The massacre was one of Ashburn's dark secrets. In 1783, settlers had wiped out a Native American tribe that had lived in the area for centuries. The settlers took the land, cutting down the sacred forest to build their town. But legend spoke of a curse laid by the tribe's shaman as he died, his blood soaking into the roots of the remaining trees. Dale and Sheriff Hale gathered a small group of townsfolk to venture into the forest. Armed with flashlights, axes, and a few shaky prayers, they set out at dawn. The deeper they went, the darker the woods became. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches heavy with dripping blood. They found it in a clearing, a massive ancient oak with gnarled roots twisting into the ground like claws. Its bark was blackened, its leaves crimson and oozing. Carvings covered the trunk, symbols Dale recognized from old texts. The air was thick with the smell of iron. "This is it," Dale said, his voice barely a whisper. As they approached, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The tree's roots writhed like snakes, and a low, guttural sound filled the air. A voice, deep and ancient, speaking in a language none of them understood. "What do we do?" Hale shouted over the noise. Dale pulled a flask from his coat. "Salt and fire," he said. "It's the only way." Chapter 5. Sacrifice. The group worked quickly, pouring salt around the base of the tree, while Dale doused its roots in kerosene. The tree fought back, its branches whipping through the air, striking anyone who got too close. One of the townsfolk screamed as the root wrapped around his leg, dragging him toward the trunk. Hale fired his shotgun, the blast in severing the root, but the man was already lost, his body swallowed by the earth. "Light it!" Dale yelled, tossing a match onto the kerosene-soaked roots. The fire caught quickly, flames licking up the trunk. The tree let out an unearthly scream, a sound that echoed through the forest and into the town. As the fire consumed it, the bleeding stopped. The air cleared, and the oppressive weight that had hung over Ashburn lifted. Epilogue. In the weeks that followed, the town began to heal. The trees returned to normal, their leaves falling peacefully to the ground. The disappearances remained unsolved, and the memories of that horrific autumn lingered like a shadow over the town. Dale returned to his solitary life, but he couldn't forget the voice of the tree, the way it had spoken to him in those final moments. "It's not over," it had said. And deep in the forest, something new began to grow.